Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Dave, welcome to the podcast. How are you, my friend?
I'm fine, Pete. You?
I'm very well, buddy. Thank you so much for coming on. I met you first at the Emergency Services Show this year, and you were absolutely brimming with knowledge and passion and insights, which is actually becomes like a rare thing. Some people can be quite dreary of some of the real challenges that are facing firefighters, PPE, and just the entire first responder sector. But you seem to have such a burning passion about one of the main subjects we're going to discuss today. And it's around this aspect of PFAS, because this is something that has emerged, in my tremendous limited understanding, over the past year or two. A lot of stuff bouncing around in America. Why has this become such a focus for the sector at the moment? And what does it mean to firefighters and sort of the organisations that we work for?
Well, up until, as you say, about a year ago, the unions globally were not really that involved in standardisation and PPE, particularly from the UK. And then, of course, I'm a member of the NFPA Correlating Committee, and we had the new president come in of the union in America, challenging the standard, making claims about the moisture barrier containing PFAS, which was creating cancers in firefighters. That's led to class actions in America. So prior to that, which we'll go into later, we were dealing with cancer per se, but not really PFAS. So now the PFAS thing is being pushed by every organisation and every union globally. So standardisers, we're left on our own a bit. But we've decided to lead on that. So it's a big, tricky item. And the World Health Organization designation of firefighters, firefighting being at risk, is really led us to know that we have to do something urgently.
Yeah, those declarations, certainly from the World Health Organization, making firefighting a cancerous or carcinogenic, profession, has really thrown, if you excuse the pun, fuel on the fire, which is given a lot of leaders, look, you can't ignore this anymore. There's an overwhelming wave of data and evidence being created for this. I'd be remiss if we didn't first just explore just a little bit of your background, because you're not one of those opportunists that has just jumped on this because it seems in fashion. You've been in this industry for around 30 years. Could you give us a bit of an influence or a bit of an impact, on what the work you've done in the past is?
Well, I mean, I joined as a firefighter and were exposed to hot fire training, where officers would throw a gallon of diesel in because it was funny. And your mother would say, this white underwear of yours is black. And you'd think, what? So very early on in my career, and that's a long time ago, I ended up in hospital on emergency oxygen, being refused permission to allow BA. And I thought, what the hell is this all about? I've got a BA set down, you're telling me not to use it. So that led me to being elected National Officer for the Fire Brigade Union, Health and Safety, in 83, a position I held for 17 years. And I work closely with government, with ministers, with civil servant and chief officers, where I think we revolutionised health and safety. On PPE, we work very closely together. There was never really a gap, and King's Cross really brought all that together. So that's my background, and I retired from the union in 2002. And since then, because I chair numerous BSI, SEN, ISO committees, I've continued with that, and I enjoy the challenge of improving the standards, protecting the wearers, not only firefighters, but industry per se.
100%. Because people forget, like, breathing apparatus and PPE is actually a small slice of the pie that is the enormous markets that these companies, and we'll name a few later on, sort of delivering their products to. Just elaborate a little bit, if you could, around back in the sort of 60s, 70s, firefighting was very strongly correlated to this aspect of being brave, and there was a big, bravado to it. And you're right, because I've heard this from many guests, this aspect of not wearing BA sets and, just get deep behind the nozzle, tuck your chin in, all this sort of stuff. What was the kind of pushback then when you were having those common sense moments where you do kind of look around and go, what is anyone else thinking this is stupid? Like, why are we what was the pushback like then?
You forgive the language, but you were considered to be a girl.
Yeah.
You know, if you fancied wearing BA, as I say, I was stood outside incidents where the smoke was pure green and acrid with a BA set on, and a senior officer came and said, "Now then, Nancy boy, get that off." An hour later, I wake up in Leeds General Infirmary on emergency oxygen. You know, I couldn't understand that for the life of me. Large chemical incidents, we'd been full chemical suits, and officers had come paddling in their shoes, you know, with no protection. So it was, as you say, the bravado of it. You know, look at me, I'm dirty, so I'm a good firefighter, and that took a lot of changing. A hell of a lot of changes when the Health and Safety at Work Act came into the fire service. There was real opposition from some chiefs, from the Home Office, that we didn't need that legislation. We were already safe. Well, we were seeing firefighters die, you know, in fairly large numbers in them stages, without the knowledge of ongoing cancers and asbestosis, etc.
Help us connect the dots, if you can, around when things like BA sets, because I remember hearing a few guests talk about the big pushback when flash hoods and fire hoods first came in, and how it, you know, put firefighters in danger because, you know, the indication was it was hot around your ears, and that was the time to get out. And a lot of these was there any kind of financial argument for it though? Because you said around BA sets, I mean, what was it? Compressors just so expensive back then? Why was there a push against people using this stuff?
I don't believe it was financial. That might have been at the back of some officers' minds. I don't think that at all. I think it was simply that we're big, brave men. Because we had very few women firefighters at that stage.
Yeah.
So, you know, their attitude. It's unbelievable. Today you will hear a minority, but one or two still mentioning my ears would melt, you know, and then I'd know it was time to get out. Yeah, really. So, you know, the education process has gone a long way, but we've still got a bit more distance to travel yet.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
So help us understand when the Act came in as part of your career. There was that big pushback from the Fire and Rescue Service operators. What eventually tipped the scale for people to adopt it? And you say you took up a national position. Help us just construct a bit of a timeline with that.
Well, the Act, as you know, came in 1974. That was a universal act supported by employers and the TUC, not necessarily by the fire service per se. We had a national officer then, Mike Fordham, who became the Assistant General Secretary, who did all the legwork about introducing the legal requirements.
Okay.
But in conversations with HSE, it's rather disturbing when they say to you, is it safe to fight fires? Because if it's not, you don't do it. And even I said, well, it can't be safe. They said, well, don't do it then. And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, have you been trained? Have you been prepared? Have you got the PPE? Have you got the operational, you know,
that
plans?
safer person concept that we recognise now,
issue. And then we went on, myself with CACFO and the Home Office, we then wrote the suite of health and safety documents, which was launched by the Minister. So we did get a grip of it, but I suppose the big turning point, Pete, was the King's Cross fire.
Yeah.
Where we actually had plastic gloves melting on the hose underground. We had plastic wet legs melting on firefighters' legs. And I'd argued long before then that the safety issue around PVC plastic on the gloves and the overtrousers should be got rid of on a safety angle. And I never won that. What I did manage to then win was if I can get the Nomex overtrouser, that equals 5.25 wet legs, PVC ones, so it's cheaper. And overnight we won it on a financial, not a safety issue. So
isn't that so often the case when we know the right thing to do, but the awkward thing is, like, I had this conversation with Peter Apps the other day about second staircases in high rises, how we daren't legislate it because it's like, Any idea how expensive that shit is? No one's got an appetite for that. Just get back in your box. So just for people, and again, most people will be familiar, but we have such a wide range of listenership. So King's Cross Fire, this won't have been the first of its kind, really, but do you think it was something to do with the fact that it was so well documented? High levels of heat, trench effect, the fatalities experienced in the ticket office, those aspects, and the way that we were able to examine the damage and the bodies and the heat they were exposed to. Because I often think to myself, how many tragedies and fire incidents, and also other, police and ambulance things that they go through, have happened, and we just haven't learned those lessons because they haven't been well documented. King's Cross, with my limited understanding, was one of the few that really got a good debrief for that, what it was in the time.
Well, the government formed the public inquiry, obviously, after King's Cross. We met with the Chief of London, Jerry Clarkson, at the time, and he said to me, my lawyers will handle the fire safety angle of this, you can handle the PPE side of it. So that's how the inquiry panned out. And there was some statements in the press about firefighters sat on the platform smoking while the tube burns, And at the following day, the barristers went ballistic. Those firefighters were actually trapped there. They'd had no experience. They kept getting hit with this piston heat hitting them in the face. And they'd no idea because it was the trains coming through which were not allowed to stop. Pushing.
Stop on them, yeah.
So, it was. And the public inquiry outcome was very good. I mean, London got, in 85, about 3.25 million for new PPE overnight. Wow. So that revolutionised the overnight.
Do you think, because it's hard to just deal with the PPE in isolation, because even if we take ourselves up to today, someone has a tragic incident, we say PPE, PPE was the problem. The first thing a chief fire officer or someone would stand up and go, well, actually, no, I think the procedures and the training was implemented incorrectly, because show me other examples of individuals that have suffered these. It's easy to blame the individual. You'll have seen it before yourself. The amount of times you go into investigations and they go, well, how competent was Pete? Let's have a look at his training records. I mean, we've got some CCTV footage of him entering the thing and he didn't check the hose reel or whatever. It's hard to just deal with PPE in isolation because these are multifaceted problems, aren't they?
It is. I mean, if I give an example, I was called up about 7 o'clock one morning when I was in London by the Commandant of the Fire Service College.
Okay.
His words to me were, get your butt up here, now. So I said, well, I didn't know I worked for you, but go on. And he said, we had an individual yesterday in the hot fire training who collapsed. We took the individual over to the occupational health unit. He jumped through a plate glass window, and we saw him in the middle of the playing fields with a glistening in his stomach. So we didn't know what it was. So we got the ambulance and the police and whatever. And that just turned out to be a ring that he'd had put into his, But I then said to the chief exec, what happened then? And he said, well, forgive me, this is not my term. Grab a granny night the night before, 15 pints of beer, gets to bed at 3 o'clock, and at 8:30 we put him in, with the rest of the team in hot fire training. So I said, can you tell me what instructions you give to the crews before they go in? And he said, well, the instructor reels it off. I said, reels it off what?
Show me the paper. No, show me the safety brief.
So Pete or Dave would never actually say the same words twice. So you've got no instructions for this. And so from then on, you're right. If you're not doing things properly, training properly. First time I had a discussion, a robust one with chiefs, I said, are you instructing recruits about how to wear PPE and its limitations? And they said, why do you think they're stupid? I said, well, if you were in the chemical industry, you would get that. And you're not saying to firefighters, here's what it does, here's how to use it, here's how to maintain it, and by the way, here are its limitations. We have evolved on that, but we're not there even on that yet in 2023.
Mate, I have this. So I work in a training department in a service in the UK, and on firefighter inductions, I like to spend about an hour and a half, 2 hour session with PPE appreciation and care. So we move around in our stuff. We talk about why it needs how it rides up our back, how the fit needs to be right, how we can use it, and all this sort of stuff. And I've had pushback because the inductions are tight and the timescales and blah 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 blah. Some of the managers that manage me are saying, look, just see if it fits. Just see if it fits, put it back in the box. Then we can carry on because HR needs to talk to them. And I'm like, fucking, you're not getting it. You're not. It really boils my piss. Do you know what I mean? When people just say, oh, just check it fits and crack on. And I'm like, yeah, because it's that assumption, isn't it? Not everyone's born equal. Not everyone grew up equal. You and I had different upbringings. So your level of common sense, my dad was a building firm for 30 years or whatever. Your mum or dad will have done something different. So our appreciation for PPE, for safety, for risk appetite is so different. Yet we get people start at the start line of their fire service career and assume they're just going to pick it up at some point. But we have a legal obligation to be making them aware of the limit. We know it when we say kit. You know what I mean? If I give you a new ladder, under the pure regs and the Lola regs, I've got to train you. I've got to make sure you know how to use it. I've got to deliver any variations, show you the dangers of it, show you the limitations of it. But PPE often isn't given that same level of respect sometimes.
Well, I'm having debates with the college, with Dan Cartwright, who's the head of resilience, and others, because of austerity measures and other things. This is me clearly saying this. There is a lack of knowledge, expertise, and dare I say competence in FRSs on PPE and on procurement. I mean, we see manufacturers telling blatant lies on the portal when there's tenders out. And that brigade might ring me and say, would you give us a bit of advice? I'll say, I don't represent manufacturers, but I'll answer the questions for you. So I believe there's a need for a course at the college or somewhere to educate that. Definitely. Because we've lost all of the quality people. You got Brett Egan-Bryers of Kent, who leads for the NFCC. Yeah. My great argument is if on a resilience issue, if Brett wins the lottery tomorrow or falls under a bus, guess what? The NFCC in a bad place. And I've tried to say that, but PPE for the NFCC doesn't appear to be a big ticket item.
It just seems to fall into a strange slot, doesn't it? Because fire investigation, fire safety, health and safety, all of these have recognised accreditations and qualifications you can train yourself in. But like you say, when these organisations are going out for tender, people are in charge of procurement, they've just got a promotion from, I used to be a station manager at X station, now I'm at work at stores or equipment or appliance or whatever you call it, and I buy all the kit. You don't know what the UN numbers mean. Haven't got a freaking clue. And we're inviting salespeople with their big Gucci vehicles just to come and see us and tap dance in front of us, and we go, yeah, you're right, it is shiny. Can I have 1,000? And it's like,
well, the worst example was when the UK Fire Service and Police were in the radio communications tender, and that was a huge thing. The Sunday Times, you open the Sunday Times, and there's 7 chief officers in the O2 box at Twickenham. This is in the middle of the tender. And one of the chiefs, a close friend of mine, and I rang him up, I said, what are you doing? Have you not got a brain? And I said, you're in the middle of a tender, an O2 are tendering, and they're sponsoring you in their hospitality box at Twickenham. So, there's still a lot of that around.
If we could now just switch gears and take us through, because we kind of whistle-stop past the start of it there, some of the progressions that you saw and were part of supporting. So we spoke about the Nomex leggings. Give people, again, because a lot of listeners, you know better than me, and it references our conversation now, like how many people are being employed, how many people are changing roles, help people that, imagine I'm day one, week one, imagine I've just passed my basic training. I want to know how the kit I'm wearing got to where it is now.
Well, it evolved over time. I mean, I started in woolen trousers that were pretty warm in summer, probably held about 10 gallons of water. So if you got wet, I mean, you could hardly lift your legs. So, and if the officer asked you to put a crease in them, that was some sort of joke. You'd need a roll-on truck to get a crease in them, never mind an iron. So, and then we had the move from leather to rubber fire boots, which was one simple incident where we had a bit of entrainment of chemicals through the stitching on a leather boot. Overnight, the Home Office banned leather boots. So here we go. Here we go.
I remember that when I joined. You still got.
So here we go into rubber boots,
and
then
someone was laughing then because those were crap. Mine were anyway. They fitted horribly. Everyone wore their leather boots anyway. You were supposed to keep your rubber ones with you in case of flooding.
And the big issue around compatibility. So to date, we've not moved a long way forward on that. So your head protection, your helmet, your gloves, your clothing, your boots, your RPD. All tested to different temperatures, to different test methods, and yet here's a firefighter going in all that into the same incident. And they often say to me, Dave, are you kidding? I say, no. No, that committee is responsible for that. That committee is responsible for that. And the test methods and the temperatures. So I started using what was called the Stull curve. It's been around since the 40s and 50s. So what we now use is 25 degrees unlimited time working with some fluids. 250 degrees for 5 minutes. That's a house fire, small industrial. And then 800 to 1,000 degrees, 8 to 10 seconds. That's a flashover. And that's what we develop in our ISO committee and our SEN committee. We work around that module.
And is that enforced across all current PPE in the UK Fire and Rescue Service, if we try and narrow it down to that for now?
Well, I mean, we're still in Europe SEN, even though we left Brexit. We're still full members of SEN, Senelec, so we have to abide by the SEN standards, other than what the NFCC did recently on the clothing one. So in general, we try and get that, but you've got to go to the helmet committee convener and say to him or her, look, you need to look at these temperatures, and then you go to the footwear person, then, the RPD people. So
when we say in general we try to do that, and I'm just to total transparency, so for all the listeners, that means no to me. Because when I ask someone, and you'd be the same, are you enforcing this? If it's longer than a one-word answer, it means no, unfortunately, doesn't it? And that's the unfortunate thing. Why are we not able to do that?
I go back to a lack of knowledge and competence in FRSs. I mean, when they're going out, and won't name them, there was an FRS recently that went out for Firehood, and they rang me and they said, look, I don't sell PPE, but Matthews is claiming X. And I said, well, have you checked where Matthews had it certified and tested? Well, why? I said, because that list is on the NANDO site in the EU or the UK approved bodies in the UK, and that says that Matthews has had it tested at, let's say, BTTG, and they're competent to test fire hoods. I said, do you not know that? Yes. So these are the basics which you expect FRS personnel to know where to check.
As long as they see something in the box that say it was tested and it says XX limited, they're going, it was tested somewhere, so they feel like they're pushing ownership onto that person or that organisation.
I had a discussion yesterday where somebody said to me, it's not the FRS's responsibility on cleaning maintenance. We have it done by a third party. So I said, since when do you think that you can pass that legal responsibility onto that company? It actually stays with you. You might subsue them, but it actually lays with you. So again,
as the employer,
this thought process that an FRS can push responsibility. I mean, if you've ever watched Mark Scoggins, was the best lawyer, Mark, and he has chiefs in hysterics. I was at a meeting with every chief in the land with him, and for 10 minutes he was like a comedian. And then the next question, he says, why is every one of you not in jail? And they laughed. And he said, no, I'm being quite serious. Because a defence of not knowing is not a defence. You people know and have done nothing. That's a bigger crime.
Yeah. That's the point we're at now. Like I say, you could have claimed, innocence through just lack of knowledge, lack of information, but it is so squarely screaming all of us in the face now that just wouldn't hold water when they're in these organisations now. So when you said about testing as well, this was an interesting thing. I had a conversation with someone the other day. When people start adding stuff to Firekit, I want these special shiny bits on it. I want this special, because then they start messing about with stuff. And obviously some organisations, some services and brigades in the UK and further afield are so big that those personal requests might be worth the squeeze for the provider to actually make that. But often please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm led to believe that all that stuff's not tested to the same level either.
Well, it should be. I mean, when I'm responsible for the European standard, which is 469 for the clothing, and we have our trim on there. The trim's on there. We require a third of a metre. We say where it should be. So all of that's tested as it is. We've now got this Viz light, which glows in the day and night.
Yes.
And I've said to the people there who spoke to me, it's not a requirement, so you'll have a hard push selling it. If it's in the standard, it's a requirement. So get on the standards committee and push for what you want on there. But
I've spent some time with Luke. We've had him on the podcast, and it is one of those, when you see it, it seems obvious. You're like, oh yeah, fantastic. But you're so right. If you're not making me do it, Why would I bother? I agree it looks great, and I agree I can see you, and it's fantastic, but it's just more cost.
But the other thing, again, if I give you an example, when you buy a glove and that's certified, New York Fire Department a few years ago bought 25,000 gloves, and their chase up by UL on certification and testing is annual. It's unbelievably good. A year later, UL go in and said, this is not the glove we tested. So New York said, what are you on about? So they got hold of the manufacturer who said, we put a new liner in. Yeah, and you didn't tell the users, and you didn't come back to us to have it tested. 25,000 sets of gloves in the bin. And that company going to Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So, people keep saying to me, there are no cowboys in the PPE industry. I said, there's a lot of good companies, but there are some cowboys. Because at the end of the day, they're driven by profit. And I don't have a problem with profit as long as that does not compromising the safety of the end user.
It's a very, very difficult line to walk, especially when some of the fine print of these things say, look, it's safe, but only to this level. So don't place your firefighters in this situation and this stuff will be fine. Like when I see the evolution of some of the wildfire stuff now, I'm like, I believe it'd be very useful for certain services, but I think it'd be a hard push to say that's a replacement for firefighting PPE because it's tested to a different level, it's designed to be worn in a different environment for a different purpose. But I feel like that could be a quick card switch in some services. They're like, we're not buying 2 sets, but I'll tell you what, we'll go for this one, and there'll be a cost benefit for each one.
I mean, the deaths from wildland fires, it's not unusual to see 10 died or 12 died or 11 died at an incident. We never normally see that in structural fires, Covent Garden where we lost 5 or 6, and Scotland Distillery. And when we started looking at wildland firefighting PPE in 2000, there were virtually, this is Australia where there were 1 million of them, volunteer. They're in flip-flop shorts and a t-shirt. Yeah? So then they evolved into what's another product, which I won't name, but which was fairly flammable, and we used to get pictures and webcams showing firefighters actually on fire at wildland fires. And we had to teach people that the temperatures in wildland fires exceeds the temperatures in structural fires. And when you talk about that, and then the final point on this is last year when we had the 42 degrees here, my next door village was gutted. The whole village, because of a cornfield fire. Oh. And then it spread to the houses and gutted about, 2 or 3 dozen houses. And I went along and the firefighters are absolutely wrecked. And I said, well, what gear are you in? And they're in structural gear. So are you not in wildland gear? Yeah. Well, who don't know about that? Have you got plenty of fluids? So it's the person, not just the PPE that we're looking at. That's what we should be protecting.
100%. That behavioural side of it is also probably a nice transition into the cancerous stuff. Because, yes, you use an example there and we say, it's much hotter. Well, your structural PPE will be fine. Yes, but in reality, we know people are just going to dress down because they can't. So don't say that and say, no, you must just wear that. And you go, well, they're not going to. Today's podcast is powered by our partner Lifelines and their revolutionary approach to functional hydration. Just like in firefighting, water is essential for body function, but studies show more than 80% of firefighters are dehydrated. A 25-year study findings from the National Institute of Health showed poor hydration to be linked to early aging and chronic disease, and even mild dehydration results in significant negative impact outcomes including headaches, exhaustion, rapid pulse, irritability, and poor cognitive function. A study conducted by Yale University showed that participants who were just 1% dehydrated had a 12% increase in errors when performing tasks that required cognitive flexibility. In addition, dehydration is shown to worsen mood and attitude, contribute to confusion and poor decision making, and negatively affect memory and judgment. In other words, you really don't want your incident commander, firefighter, or for that matter any first responder on a critical scene to be even slightly dehydrated. Mild dehydration occurs when a person is just 1.5% dehydrated, a condition that does not even trigger the thirst response in most people. So just imagine how quickly a firefighter or any first responder can and does become dehydrated in their day-to-day duties, which is why I address my hydration first thing every day with Lifelines. Go into the notes for this episode and specifically check out Lifelines Hydro Fuel and Hydro OG by clicking in the notes for the podcast for a clean energy solution designed for those who demand more from their day. Now back to the show. this aspect of behavioural transitioning into PPE. So it's a big aspect around the cancer stuff, and FBU have done some great work amongst other organisations about shower within the hour, wiping down. We've got Joe from D-Wipe coming on the podcast soon. Different companies, of course, exist, Hero Wipes and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of behavioural stuff that's like low-hanging fruit that we could do ourselves to help ourselves, and I'm sure as you reflect on your career, there's a lot of things that actually the individual could have taken responsibility for. But then take us into this aspect of what's stuck in our kit, what isn't stuck in our kit. You and I have met, I think my first meeting was with an individual who was doing some LCO2 work, and that's a big technology that's evolved in America. Help us shine some light on different areas of that map, if you could, as to what aspects the PPE poses to the user.
Well, on the American Correlating Committee, we've got NFPA 1851, which is cleaning, maintenance and repair of firefighters PPE, presently under revision, and that will undoubtedly address the PFAS issue. I realised that we'd got nothing in Europe, and therefore at my European committee I proposed that we do something along that lines, and it was blocked by two major multinationals, twice.
Okay.
And I didn't know why, but they obviously knew then about PFAS and I didn't.
Yes, and they thought this is going to be a tremendously costly overhaul for us to try and get this out of our thing. How dangerous is it to firefighters? Talk to me about levels. Talk to me about what it even is. Talk to me about how, because I try, and I've heard people give analogies of asbestos in the past. I'm not sure that completely correlates, but help people that are very new to this information understand what it is, what percentages, what levels it harms us.
Well, if I just say, first of all, 10 years ago on my European committee, we started looking at cancer of firefighters, and we dealt with the PAHs on the outer shell, so combustion from smoke. We've had firefighters at chemical incidents lost the mucous lining of the lungs because they've inhaled this stuff, So we started looking at that. The smoke cloud from a fire, there's 2,000 chemicals, numerous of them are carcinogens and known as that. So we've been looking at that and how we clean that. And we did that. Okay. And then the PFAS issue evolved and the WHO evolved. So there's 10,000 of these chemicals, a minimum of 10,000. There was one individual firefighter who was at the NFCC PPE symposium earlier this year, very agitated, and in the end was allowed to ask his question, and he said, I want rid of this effing PFAS that's causing cancer firefighters. So they said, what? He said, this chemical. And they said, well, which of the 10,000 are you talking about? And he said, no, the one that's causing cancer. Now, the big issue is that these polyfluoroalkali substances, the 10,000 of them, nobody yet has done an assessment of which of those are dangerous, serious, or not.
Right.
So do we deal with 10,000? Because that'll take us rest of my life and yours and everybody else's life. So nobody's saying to me, we'll deal with this, this and this. And that's in USA, that's in Europe, internationally, or UK. So if you...
It's like, for very simplistic terms, it's like an elimination diet. If you suddenly get a flare-up or something's causing you some horrific personal challenges, you need to try and eliminate one by one things. Because if you did just throw out all 10,000, 9,900 or whatever, might be absolutely harmless to individuals. Is it such an expensive and complex testing process to get these things? I've literally know nothing about it.
Well, we... In the ISO community, on the ISO committee, which has far more end-user representation, we've been looking at particulate protection for about 3 years, so before PFAS. And we had no real laboratories globally who could test that. There were a few private industries, multinationals, who did a bit of work on that. So we've managed to build up with a few labs that they can do the particulate protection.
So we're talking there specifically for the RPE?
No, even for clothing. Because the particle can go in the clothing, can it get through the clothing?
The layers and the membranes, and how can it actually impregnate?
So we're looking at that, and the UK now is relatively good on its BA procedures, relatively good, because the one thing for sure, if you inhale it, you're in trouble. Now, I will say this, I've spoken to the Redmond Foundation in America, their BA procedures are very poor.
They are very poor. They seem to throw caution to the wind an awful lot. And I'm not saying they're poor firefighters. I'm saying what they must be doing to themselves is my concern. They're great saving people, whatever, but at what cost? I feel like, and again, I feel like we're throwing our minds back 30 years. They celebrate their first responders much more than we do, which I think is great. There's a great deal more support for them. 9/11 obviously accelerated that as well. But I think we really could just dial that back a little bit and say, is it necessary for me to be putting... It's like a police officer not wearing a stab vest or a bulletproof vest. It's like, look, I get you're a great shooter and you're very competent, but why not just,
Well, I was chairing a meeting at the Southeast French Training Centre near Marseille. And in France, if you have a 5 pump or over, you have to have a doctor on the scene. So that's a good thing. And Colonel Philippe Agrifco is the head of medicine for the French Fire Service, and I've known him quite a while. And he said, I want to have a chat with you. He said, my hot fire training instructors were all constantly complaining of being lethargic. So he fetched Marseille University in, who said, okay, let's go look at the unit. So what's your plan? So the hot fire training unit, the officers do the training, go have a cup of tea, leave it an hour, and then go in and reload. So Marseille University said for 24 hours after that burn, you're above the minimum exposure levels. So you shouldn't be in there unless you've got a mask on of some description.
Yeah. Everything is gassing
and
off.
He said, and the stuff that we were burning, like you idiots in the UK are still burning. He said, we now start with pine chippings and we only burn pure chestnut wood. And he took me in the chambers. One's black, like ours are black, filthy. And he took me in the other and it's almost clean. So he said, so we've moved on to that. So we're aware of all that. But the issues is does PFAS go? It's on, and the claims in America by the union is it's going through onto the moisture barrier. The PFAS in the moisture barrier is killing firefighters from cancer.
Okay.
Now,
because then when even though we clean it at high temperatures and blah blah blah, it's not getting it out. When we put it back on, it's still there, and when we heat up, we're absorbing it, or what's?
Pete, I have to say, I'm not signed up to that yet because it's everywhere. It's in your frying pan, it's in your clothing, it's in your car, it's in your electronics, in your home. And we measure it in parts per billion, not parts per million. So I spoke to a scientist who said, Dave, I'm not sure you'd find a person on the planet who didn't have a measure in their body of PFAS. Yeah. So and then people say to me, well, take it out. So we put it in the repellency of our garments when they're cleaned. And they said, well, take it out. I said, listen, I've challenged the FBU and NFCC to come up with their position. We can clear this overnight. We can take the PFAS chemical out, but the presentation I did at ESS shows you will then absorb the oil, the petrol, and the chemicals, and you will be highly flammable.
So help me understand when we look at the differences in the Americans' kit, because it is significantly heavier and stuff like that. And we won't dwindle too much on this period, but just help it because the helmets are significantly larger. And then I want to circle back to where PFAS is in the UK.
The American kit tends to be exceptionally well made. I mean, really well made. But as you say, their standard is different to Europe and it's different to ISO. We're going through a revision of the 1971 standard, which will become 1970, and there'll be some issues around PFAS addressed in there. I think theirs is more about intervention protection as opposed to potentially defensive, because when I was a young firey, there was no such thing as defensive firefighting ever. And if you said, well, why are we going in there? Because it's on fire. Well, if it's going from end to end, well, somebody might be in there. Well, if there's somebody in there, they're dead. Because it's going.
You ain't saving a person.
Exactly.
You're recovering a body.
So we had to evolve past that, and even insurance companies wanted you fighting fires. And then you said, well, if a firefighter gets killed, that's £1 million. So are you weighing all this in? So the fire kit in America is heavier, very well made. But what I've now got is the head of research and medicine for the IFF, the union, met with me in Greenville in USA in June to talk about what we were doing in ISO, because he's now coming on the ISO committee. And his comment, not mine, was, I am hacked off. We're going to an NFPA meeting because every effing time they introduce a new test method. And I want to see what you lot are doing because you've got a lot of end users from around the globe on the committee. I think the IFF is evolving. I've noticed on a few podcasts and webinars recently that the president and others are not raging about PFAS, but raging about cancer. And everybody signed up about cancer. So I'm wondering, is that part of their class action? You know, there's class actions in America against everybody that affects us as well. Or whether they're just beginning to watch us say, we're not on that page with you yet. We're totally on the page of cancer. We've dealt with PAHs. We're looking at what else we can do. But this is a firefighter that we've got to defend when he or she goes in this job and not expose them to being flammable or getting the chemicals going through onto the skin. So it's a bigger picture. And to try and target the moisture barrier seems to me, I can't get that at the minute. I just don't get it.
Yeah, there's too much of a loose thread. Help me understand why that equals that. Is it a red herring, or is it correlation, or is it causation? You know what I mean? That's what you're trying to understand, I suppose.
And do you know sometimes leadership is about being brave, and that's not always saying what you think the left might want to hear. It's by saying what is factual and taking the broader picture. I mean, when I was head of safety with the FBU, my relationship with the Home Office, with the CACFO, the politicians, I was health and safety advisor to the Labour Party front bench, was exceptionally good. And I took flack for that from the left wing. Why do you talk to them prats, you know? I said, because the chiefs and the politicians are responsible in law for health and safety, not the union. So, you know, I've got to talk to them to get them to do it. We can demand things, but they're the ones that have to apply it. So leadership can be tough, but you have to be brave and sensible to do it.
So they always say things like, you know, the US sneezes and we catch a cold. How worried or concerned do you think some of the leaders in these fire and rescue services need to be? Obviously, everyone's just had a pay rise last year or early this year. Things are very difficult, period of austerity. They must be scared to death of what this means for them. What falls out the end of this funnel? And when do you anticipate this coming to the front line where they have to make a decision about it? Have you seen any, it's probably not fair to mention specific services, but have you seen anyone go in first? And you don't have to name people, but are the people already going, there's enough data there for me, Dave, I'm making a move?
We've not seen it as yet, and I mentioned previously, I'm actually meeting the head of resilience and Steve Topham, who's the NFCC for PPE in a couple of weeks' time. And I met Steve at the ESS and said, look, we need a statement from you on PFAS and where we are. As you mentioned, the FBU have done the unbelievable. Yeah, they've done the great work on UCLAN, and that's around what we were aware of, the PAHs and clean, you know, and be clean. We've now got fire stations in Scandinavia that don't have a clean camp policy anymore. They have a clean station policy. So there's a lot of things going on, and it's bringing all that together. But in the UK, since my day, it's now the NFCC that seems to write the guidance and not the Home Office. I don't buy into that. I think it should be the Home Office. And I'm waiting for these...
Why?
Well, the Home Office, you know, the ministerial people, the civil servants people, the paid for people who are responsible for fire and police. And the NFCC, I mean, their grant this year or last year was astronomical. And when you think, well, what are we doing with that? Because I'm not close to it, but I don't see out on, other than Brett and, you know, Kent and South East and what they're doing on a collaboration, I don't see it. So Steve tells me that the NFCC Contaminants Group, which works under Wayne Brown's Health and Safety Committee, will make a statement. I don't know what that statement will be. But actually, there is no link with us standardisers formal. So nobody's telling us standardisers what to do. We're actually doing it. So we're moving because we've been firefighters, and we're moving ourselves because nobody on that side, nobody in R&D, nobody in the safety community is saying anything to us. So we're just having to do it and lead it.
When you've referenced many times the union have been responsible for some tremendous work supporting firefighters across the UK. A lot of the publications that I've seen and been aware of seem to focus heavily on this behavioural aspect, so they can get their members on board to control the controllables, do things within their own control to help their life, longevity of their career. Do you anticipate them wading in on this? What experiences have you had with them recently and the influence that they have?
Well, I've met Ricardo de Torres, who's the National Health and Safety Officer, with his committee about 3-4 months ago, advising them about which committees, British Standards committees, they should sit on in order to feed into SEN and ISO. I had a good meeting with Ben Selby at the ESS, which is the new Assistant General Secretary, and only this week the union are now going to apply to come on what I think are the 3 key BSI committees that they've not been on since I left in 2002. And, you know, I've always said, if you're more interested in who's the president of Cuba than the PPE that your firefighters wearing, I'm not on the same page. And it's a fundamental that a firefighter daily somewhere in the world is fighting a fire, and in the UK. So let's please concentrate on these issues. And the Standards Committee, Pete, are stacked with manufacturers and test houses with very few end users. And whilst many of them are reasonable and good, if I start tweaking the high-vis standard slightly, I can wipe 3M off the market overnight. So when I'm looking at revising that standard, I will get 16 3M people on the committee. Because in Europe, you can have one from every country, so you could have 30 if they've got a facility in each of them countries. So it's heavily stacked in the manufacturer's favour. In the UK, we have a lot of good manufacturers who are sensible in their development and what they want, but it's not unusual to see somebody looking after a vested interest. And if I see that and say that's affecting the safety of firefighters, then we ain't buying that. So, you know, if you're not aware of where they're coming from, and that's what I'm saying to the union, you need to sit there and I'll advise you who's who. So when we're talking about this test method, watch Pete, because he's manufacturing X. I mean, if you're talking about a test method to increase the temperature, he won't agree because it'll affect his product, you know. So, I've been on 30 years and I learn something new every day. So these, you know, these kids, these women and men who come on committees are frightened by the language, frightened by the technical issues. And I say don't be, because on the NFPA committee, when the union speaks, everybody listens. So I said, get on these committees, because when you speak, everybody should listen.
When services, because we've spoken about that a few times there about the competency and the capability of individuals in these roles, what, as maybe some key pieces of advice, would you suggest if people are entering these positions, or if fire and rescue services and brigades are appointing new individuals? What's some key pieces of legislation or courses or familiarization they should really be? I wonder if that might be a useful takeaway for people. What things should they acquaint themselves with?
Well, I can go back a long time when they used to put fire prevention officers in posts with no training. And we had a big row about that, and we got a training course for FP officers at the college. So initially, you should not be appointing an officer in charge of PPE without she or he having some training, or at least appoint them and then give them an initial. However you decide to get somebody in to give that training. The NFCC should have that facility. The Fire Service College should have that facility to say, look, here's a webinar or a virtual course, but these are the things you should look at.
They should, but I don't think they do. Do they?
None of them.
That's what I mean.
And I mean, Brett is the
linchpin. What should they be? What would you put into a course?
Well, I've already got a course that's 6.5 hours long. It's about 120 slides. We use that globally. Okay. That's the thing I'm talking to Head of Resilience and Steve about, whether we can get that into the college. You could do that virtually, but I believe such a course is better face-to-face, and then follow-ups can be virtual. So you're talking about...
Is that something people can sign on to now? If we put a link in the notes, would that be something people could... Can they register for it now?
The college have not agreed to do the course yet. So what we need is the NFCC badge of approval to do such a course. So that's why I've got to meet Steve and get that around it. I mean, I don't sell PPE. I've never ever recommended PPE, but I am retained by some FRSs. And what I won't do is be part of the decision making, but I'll do all the technical work for them and then say, right, here's the 3 companies, over to you. I'm not getting involved in the decision making. So it's how do you check compliance of garments? I advise Shropshire, and I've done for 20 years, So they ring me up in the mid of the COVID and say, we've just bought 20,000 medical masks. Do you know if they're compliant? So I said, are you asking me after you bought it? And they said, yeah. So I said, well, where's the documentation? So the agent for the product won't talk to us, but he'll talk to you. So I said, but I'm retained by you, so if he talks to me, I'm going to tell you. Anyway, so I talked to the geezer, send me your CE certificate of compliance. So I get all these documents. No, I want your CE certificate of compliance. Here, it's this one. No, that's your self-certification, son. Where is the laboratory that tested it? Who certified it? So I had to say to Shropshire, not compliant. So you've just £20,000 up, whatever. We had to go to HSE, who got an emergency committee in place and get, because it was dual purpose, because Shropshire were actually giving the injections, you know. They did a fantastic job, Shropshire. So it's, where do they need to check a compliance certificate? What are the standards? Just the basics of them. What are the standards I need? How do we arrive at them? The compatibility issue. Because if you're buying everything from Matthews, he'd be an idiot to sell everything, because then I'm responsible for that compatibility testing. So I simply take the fire hood out and throw it to somebody else. The user then has to do that compatibility testing, and that is very difficult, and they don't really know how to do that. So there's lots of things like compatibility, ergonomics. Sizing is still a huge issue. When you come to women,
I was going to say, what have you seen in the way of women's sizing? Because it seemed to get a lot of attention 4 years ago, but I feel like it's dropped off, or maybe I've just not been aware of it very much.
But it's kicked on globally. I mean, I'm responsible for the mannequin test, which is the test that firefighters want to watch. You know, I want my kit on there to see how it burns and what's the predicted burn injury. So in the revision, I said, right, we've got a male mannequin, I want a female mannequin in there, which we've done. And we're now, unfortunately, rowing and arguing about what the size of this female mannequin is. On RPD, we've got 5 headphones to represent the global population of Asians, of Afro-Caribbeans, of, you know, whites, whatever. But we've nothing on women other than what Mandy Sterling of Leicestershire wrote, the anthropometrics of UK women firefighters. That's before she tragically died of diabetes or whatever. Most of the large manufacturers and multinationals, for instance, will have 58 sizes for women and 58 sizes for men. So you should fit in one of them. But if I was still with the union, I'd be taking the legislative approach, which I believe, and it's done sometimes, is no, I'm not interested in you fitting me into that. I'm interested in you measuring me to ensure I'm fitted correctly. So all the manufacturers have teams that go out and do it. But if you do it properly, if you're extremely tall or you're small, or if you've got small hands or big feet, you can't do it. So you have to have all these extra sizes. And we know the lead times is 20, 24 weeks. If it's coming from China and it's a big foot or a small hand, you're talking 30 weeks. And I'll say to chiefs, that might mean a crew off the run for 30 weeks. Have you figured that one out? Ooh. I mean, the other example is after Grenfell. We had 40 trucks at Grenfell. So the day that they closed the job down, potentially, I said to the commissioner at the time, it's not only financial, it's logistical. Are you going to take them 40 trucks off the run? That's 40% of fire cover in London. Go tell the mayor you're doing that. Because they've got to be showered, they've got to be cleaned. Because London only have one set, as you know, and then they have 8 locations around the brigade where they have this relief crew. So there's lots of things that we could teach these young women and men who take this position. But please don't put them in post with nothing, because that's not fair.
No, because they will be the theoretical subject matter expert that gets the finger pointed at them, and they've not been given a fair opportunity to have a great enough awareness in this sector to be able to advise on purchases and stuff like that. It's a worrying landscape at the minute. What do you see happening over the next 12 months then? Give us that roundup of what things you see emerging over the horizon. And you've mentioned a few aspects of discussions and new legislation that's coming.
Well, we got the World Health Organization statement last March, I think it was. And the chair of the ISO TC94, which is global PPE, everything. That's Rose Shepherd from Australia. Wrote to my chair on the ISO Firefighters Committee and said, you will now address this issue as a matter of urgency. You will. So that was in July this year. So in August this year, my chair said to me, it falls under your working group, get on with it. So I formed a project group in August, and I closed the applications for it early because I got a balance of manufacturers and end users to look at the we called it PG contaminants because PFAS was too focused and actually it just winds people up. So that PG contaminants I formed in August, we've met 3 times since. We're meeting monthly. It's led by an officer from South Australia who's a cancer survivor, an officer and a union person. So that's a good start. And I've said to...
Who is that? I might make for a fascinating individual to have a conversation with.
Afterwards, if you want his contact detail, Neil Manglesdorf, South Australia. Yeah. And I've said to Neil, I want a draft report by February 7th, 8th and 9th next year when we meet for 3 days at BSI in London. And we know that we'll do that. I'm not saying we'll have the answer, but we'll certainly have a draft report. What we've already done at a meeting that we held last Thursday, I think it was, about 10, all of the ISO standards are ensemble. So unlike SEN, where I said to you the difficulty is its head, its feet, its whatever, in ISO it's all one standard in 10 pounds. So we've now revised about 12 standards. The project group has looked at it and said, we want these changes, we want this added, about PFAS, about contaminants, bump. Now we've no legitimate way of doing that. So I, as the convener, I'm going to write to each PG leader in the next month and say, this is what I want you to consider when you consider the ballot results with comments, and come back in February next year about what you're going to do all of that. Some of those are manufacturers, so some might get hacked off because it'll affect their product. But yes, so the ISO committee, and I think America, the union is, I think they're heavily involved in that, so they're interested in that. And if I just said, I was on a Cooney's webinar last week, I think it was, and they had a spokesperson on PFAS from EU, one from UK and one from USA, and the outcome is we will have 3 different sets of regulation. So if you're a manufacturer, you're going to have to look to 3 different sets of regulations. And what Cooney's informed us of, and this is frightening, a venture capitalist in America has put $500 million up front as ambulance chasers to go to lawyers for class actions against whatever. And the UK PFAS regulation consultation at the moment actually contains harm. So Matthews doesn't have to get cancer. Matthews worried about cancer, so I can sue for harm. So, we can't even get a global position on this. So manufacturers are going to have a huge task in addressing who puts what in my gear. Unknowingly.
Mate, that seems like an absolute quagmire of difficulty. So this, when it comes out in February, will that be an education piece that we distributed to the sector?
Well, we as standardisers, we have to go through the balloting process, and we're fairly well advanced on some of these. That's why it's difficult for me to get these in. They will be in, and then if they're published, those standards are then what will be called up or can be called up. There is no legal requirement in Europe to call up an ISO standard. You have to call up the EN. Right. Well, the EN won't be there, so we'll have ISOs. Now, in general, Brett and the NFCC are likely to call these up, but they'll have to be published. You can quote them when they're at an advanced draft standard, which they are at now. So SEN, I've got a meeting on I think it's 12th of December, where I've now added cancer firefighters with no cleaning standard in Europe because of this blockage, and I'm now saying we can't continue with that, we've got to do something. So it's weaving your way through, and some of these multinationals will spend more than you and I earn in a lifetime on a piece of R&D to stop us developing something if it harms their product.
Yeah. Mate, that is quite the mountain to climb. So you've been retired for quite some time now, and you continue to persevere with something like this. It seems to be the most challenging time and most complex time to navigate this landscape that I can certainly recall in the last 15 years or longer. What do you think, if you were to throw your mind forward 30 years when I've retired, and what do you think we'll look back on and say we really should have done that sooner?
Well, when you say retired, I retired from the union. I run a company, so I'm not retired, as it were. In 30 years' time, I was asked by DuPont 20 years ago to predict the future. And I said disposable fire kit. And this was to DuPont's board. And they laughed at me. I don't think they're laughing so much now because some people are looking at a different outer shell, so you can have the outer shell cleaned and the inside's all right. Well, is it all right? I hope that the safety of firefighters is paramount. I hope the safety of industry. I mean, if you look at the high vis that contractors on the rail or the roads wear, it's disgraceful. That's no longer compliant. Yeah. But the General Secretary of the FBU is now the President of the TUC. So I'm trying to get him at the TUC to lift up this PPE for all workers, you know. So I want the safety workers to be addressed, for end users to be represented on the committees so we can hear theirs, particularly if you look at what the outcomes of Grenfell. And I've said to the FBU, you've got to be on this RPD committee because, you know, they want you to do the canary job and not don your mask until you think you're safe. Well, you might just keel over and say, well, I won't safe, would I? So we need better PPE. It needs to be lighter because we're only wearing it for 6% of the time, the structural gear. And the other big issue that I'm heavily involved in at the minute is CBRN. I've now got a standard in ISO that's at final ballot because it's CBRN for first responders. And there are products on the market now that you could wear as your station uniform. And that is
There's a real variation, isn't there, when you look at police, ambulance, you know, fire. It's astonishing how different the PPE appears to be, and we're all arriving at the same incidents.
So CBRN, it should be lighter, it should be more comfortable. The gender issue we'll have got rid of. I mean,
because it's a barrier to people even wanting to don it.
I mean, if I just go back, I'm that old to know that we actually had asbestos flash hoods and gloves, and I used to don the asbestos flash hood every day to test it. So, you know, when they say, what's your risks? Well, I'm glad we've got a 30-year register for asbestosis. So we've a lot to do. We've a lot to do. And you know, the cost of standardisers, at least with COVID, we do a lot virtual now. But for non-English speakers in my international, I can only run meetings 12 till 2 UK time because that's early morning in America. It's late in Australasia and Asia. But the non-English speakers often want to say to me, Mr. David, and that means we don't understand. So I say, come on, let's go have a cup of coffee. They can't do that on a virtual meeting. So we do need, you know, there's the London Agreement on cost and environment, but you sometimes got to sit in a room and then have a cup of coffee and then a beer at night and say, stop that blockage. You know, we've got to get rid of that for the safety of these end users.
Do you see anyone taking up the mantle of this beyond yourselves and other organisations? Because I say with respect, you perhaps won't still be doing this job in 20 or 30 years' time. You may be, but you may not be, with the greatest of respect. Do you see younger generations, obviously we have a lack of awareness, and I include myself in that, with the same level of passion and interest to actively be there on the field, you know, actually in the dust and the sand, taking the cuts and the bruises? Because a lot of us sit back in the stands and throw stones and say, you should be doing better, you should be doing better. You are very much in the trenches trying to shift these chess pieces. Is there other individuals with an appetite for this? Do you see the next generation with a passion for this? Because we're ultimately, I mean, you and your generation are paying the cost now, but we will also pay the cost.
A couple of years, just before COVID, in America, they have the Australasian Fire Advisory Council, AFAC, and all of the brigades pay to that, and then AFAC give all the technical information and write specifications for the brigades if they want that. So I got the director of AFAC and another person from the AFAC Council to present to Sir Ken Knight, and we then had the system where Terry Brewer was in charge of procurement, you know, and both of these presenting to them about, look, and my idea was, and these figures were just thrown in, if every FRS put 10,000 in the middle, then I said at the time, then you put Brett Egan-Bryers in and somebody else, and you have a methodology of training for this resilience, you know, for people coming in. And I presented that to the CAC4 Council, where it was blocked. So that's what we need. You've only got, I mean, the problem with the South East Collaborative with Brett is that he's only representing 50% of the FRSs. The other 50 are not in the collaborative garments and don't want to be, by the way. So I think we need a national system.
Why? What do you think the argument is for those that are not interested in the collaborative
certainly
garments?
they're not interested in this higher level that the NFCC have just taken us to. We haven't got evidence of an injury to a firefighter in PPE caused by PPE in the last 20 years in Europe. Not one. So why would you want to push it up when you're only in it 6% of the time? So all these other 50% that talk to me don't want to be in that. So we haven't got national collaborative buy-in or procurement.
What does your gut feel say? Does your gut feel say, and feel free not to respond to this, do you think we should shift to a higher level given we wear it almost never and it's already meeting many of the standards with regard to exposure to, not contaminants, but certainly to fire and other risks?
Well, I'm the convener of the European Committee who writes that standard, so of course I defend that standard. And again, we have users on there from around Europe, and there is no evidence-based. What I say to people, if you want to improve a standard, you've got to prove some R&D and some evidence. I'm not, because Matthews has introduced a new product, am I going to change it for that? So there is no injuries to firefighters in Europe over the last 20 years from PPE, caused by PPE. Yeah. So why do I want to up it?
Yes. You see a similar thing with vehicles where there's an over-engineering aspect. We could all have Formula One this and Formula One that, but what do I want my vehicle to do? Okay, then to make something mass market, affordable and sustainable, you've got to go, the least viable product sounds horrible and dangerous, but what we're saying is the least viable, safest option. There's somewhere to meet in the middle on that spectrum, isn't it? Otherwise, we'd all be going around in £100,000 gear.
We had an example a few years ago, Sir Ken and I, where it was the Chief of West Yorkshire went ballistic over the 145 ladder. Absolutely ballistic. They had an incident, an accident, and Sir Ken said to him, "Are you on the committee that deals with this?" "No, why not?" "Did you not read the draft when we circulated it to NFCC or whoever?" "No." "Well, please don't fire at us after we've published it. Fire at us before." That's why end users have got to be in there. And Brett is now just widening the number of NFCC reps on committees because he can't handle it all.
No, you've got to be part of that conversation. Otherwise, like you say, you just sit on the sidelines until the people that are doing the work come to a decision, and then you just throw stones and objections to it. And you're like, look, come and be part of the conversation. We're not so elitist to think we've got all the answers, but we're the ones peddling. So come on, jump on, pedal, throw in your answers, your innovation, your diverse approaches to this. But yeah, it's important for people to be part of the conversation because fire and rescue services, first responders, and ultimately the public and their families will be the ones that pay the long-term cost. And they often pay that cost in private. I really appreciate the work you do, mate. I think you are a font of knowledge. I would love to perhaps have you on in February next year when we're 3 or 4 steps forward and talk about what the outcomes are and help share that knowledge. Because again, like you say, these papers are out there, these things are available for people to read, but sometimes they can, not always, but can be written in a way that is difficult for people to digest. And I think you've done a wonderful way today of simplifying it and helping people understand what they have an obligation to do and the cost of not taking that action.
Yep, well, that's where we're going.
Dave, thank you so much for your time, mate. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Pete.
The Firefighters Podcast was created to recognize, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our driving purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, then please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you're in the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.